So, ladies and gentlemen, up front, and Steve talked about the importance of these relationships in these type forums, but I did want to take the opportunity to echo his comments and sentiments and thank General Ham and the AUSA team for yet another just first-class event. Let there be no doubt, and I truly mean this from the heart, that a part of what has been our competitive advantage since I've observed, since I've been old enough to know what I was looking at, probably about the time General Lawrence was beating me to death as a young major working for her when she was a lieutenant colonel. The first time I worked for her, first of 4 times that I remember, because I used to be a lot taller, to the folks that are in the audience here. But let there be no doubt that a part of what has given us the competitive advantage has been forums like this where we get the opportunity to share ideas. So the sharing of ideas is very important. But I think the thing that's also interesting and more importantly is we get the opportunity to do as our 32nd Chief of Staff of the Army and former President and CEO of AUSA, General Gordon Sullivan, often stated when faced with very complex problems, the thing that we get the opportunity to do is we get to put into practice, real practice, this idea of placing the intellectual before the physical. So that said, General Ham, I couldn't let this moment pass again without thanking you and the AUSA team for not only the great work that you do around the globe for our soldiers, for our family, and most importantly for our Army. But I wanted to thank you for being the centerpiece to that competitive advantage and continuing to bring us together. So if I could get a round of applause for everybody for AUSA. So before I move on to what I came here to say and hopefully what you came here to hear, I'd also like to take a minute to recognize and thank you, our industry partners. And I never let a moment pass, and I never speak publicly without taking the opportunity to mention that because that's how much I value our relationship. So day in and day out, none of what the Army accomplishes, I believe, would be possible without your innovation, without your agility, and most importantly, without your patriotism and passion for ensuring that the United States Army remains the best equipped force on the globe and constantly and consistently has the best equipment that's available. So as the 3rd largest organization of any kind in the world, I think the attribute that I believe separates our Army from peer competitors, and one of the very important attributes that separates us from peer competitors is the deeply rooted and evolving relationship that we have with FFRDCs, that we have with academia, and that we have with both our commercial and our defense industry partners. So as a soldier, and more importantly these days, as the father of a soldier who just returned from Afghanistan about 60 days ago, over the years I can tell you firsthand that I believe that your efforts have been critical to informing this idea of the art of the possible. So in thinking about the complex global security environment, so Steve painted as clear a picture as you could possibly have about the complexity of this environment. But in thinking about it, I'm reminded of a quote from the past. And that quote is, to know your future, you must first understand and then learn from your past. So that said, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that 28 years ago today, on this very day, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And I believe at that time, given what we've been kind of doing as an Army up to that point, but at that time it set forth a chain of events that I believe tested and challenged the global reach. It challenged the industrial base. That event challenged the innovation, the training, the doctrine, the leadership of the Army, probably at that time like no time on such a grand scale since World War II, and in a different way, in a different type of fight since Vietnam. Our performance in the Gulf War remains one of the most one-sided victories in history. But on this anniversary, of the start of what became victory, eventually victory in the Gulf. I believe what's most instructional as we start to get our minds around how we got to that point, what did it take to build that Army? What's most instructional is reflection on this idea that in order to achieve probably the most one-sided victory that we'd ever had, it took the institution, the global fabric that is in this room coming together to produce that Army. So I think there are some parallels from the climate of that time, and obviously this environment is a lot more complex that we deal with today. But I think what's significantly different is a realization that advances in technology have the potential to fundamentally change the future of character and future character of warfare. So in kind of conceptualizing this, to quote our 39th Chief of Staff of the Army, because he's been very vocal about how technology has the ability to change the future character of warfare, and he's been doing this for about 18 months. He believes the shift in the character of war offers an opportunity for us to adapt proactively, maintaining and remaining overmatched, and forcing our competitors to react to us instead of us reacting to them. Now, I know it's not lost in this audience, but I think it's an undeniable fact that artificial intelligence, machine learning, evolutions in the development of autonomous vehicles, which you will probably hear a lot about today. I believe you got Dave Bassett and team speaking, and they'll deep dive into some of the more tactical aspects of the network. Evolutions in information technology, and some of the tools that enable more efficient and automated uses of spectrum that Steve talked about. I believe these technologies, and I don't know that, again, I know it's not lost on this audience, but these technologies definitely have the ability to be game changers and fundamentally influence the way we're going to fight in the future. So as your 37th Chief Information Officer in G6 of the Army, my fundamental question, as I look deep, 2 to 3 ridge lines over, at the Army, as General Ham explained, of 2028, the fundamental question for me is, how are we adapting the Army as an institution? How are we fundamentally adapting the Army as an institution to be able to account for and rapidly integrate the advances in information technology that you are developing? And so as I look back at the great work that was done by General Sorensen as I was in the CIO G6, and the great work that was done by General Lawrence, followed by Bob Farrell, that takes us back probably 10 to 12 years in terms of the capability that's been developed. But in trying to conceptualize where we are, because we've been having lots of discussions about network modernization. One of the questions that often comes up is, so how did we get here? What did we miss? What I tell people when this comes up, I said, well, the Army was kind of busy. And there were a lot of things going on, especially at the enterprise over the last 15 to 16 years of continuous combat. So why all the focus on the enterprise? That's where the bad guys were. At that time, there was no such thing as tactical cyber. That was born over the last 5 or 6 years. And so a lot of our focus over the last 15 to 16 years has been focused on the enterprise, because that is exactly what General Sorensen, that is exactly what General Lawrence, that is exactly what Bob Farrell needed to be focused on, because that's where the threat was, and that's where the threat was evolving. So that's the look back. We've learned some great lessons, but for me, as I celebrated my 1-year anniversary in this job just yesterday, probably the greatest lesson learned has been the fact that for the past 15 or 16 years, I'm not sure, because of where we were focused, that as an institution, and it was nobody's fault, but as an institution, that we figuratively had our sensors in the right place. So because institutionally, again, there were pockets of excellence, and I've had this discussion in open forum before, but as an institution, we figuratively didn't have our sensors in the right place to be able to really understand the evolutions in technology and the might of commercial industry. So absent having our sensors in the right places, figuratively, what did we do? We bought stuff. We reacted to technology, especially at the tactical level. And we reacted at an alarming pace because of the resources that we had available to us. So looking forward, how do we turn the ship? How do we evolve this third largest organization called the United States Army? I think that our leadership over the last 90 days has charted a great course for us. So to that end, our new Army vision laid out by the Secretary of the Army challenges us all, and it's a great challenge to build the Army of 2028 that is ready to deploy, an Army that is ready to fight, and an Army that is ready to win decisively against any adversary, anytime, anywhere, in a joint multi-domain high-intensity conflict, while simultaneously deterring others and maintaining our ability to conduct what he describes as irregular warfare. So, with the senior Army leadership's new vision as our North Star, and with the National Defense Strategy of 2018 as our foundation, given the current and future reliance on technology, we must posture ourselves now to deliver the network required to make this vision that the Secretary and the Chief have outlined a reality. So, ladies and gentlemen, my interpretation of this vision of the Secretary and the Chief and what it means to me as the Chief Information Officer in G6 of the Army is that, simply put, we must modernize, and simultaneously, given the threats that Steve laid out and others, we must be ready. So in order to be ready, in order to posture your Army to fight and win, like no other time in our history, we need you as what I consider to be our strategic partners, our indispensable strategic partners in this fight. In positioning the Army to leverage commercial innovation, cutting-edge science and technology, and rapid prototyping, the leadership of the Army identified 6 priorities. These priorities are intended to enable our ability to shoot, and as General Milley and the Secretary describe it, our ability to move, in addition to our ability to protect and our ability to sustain. I know many of you are very aware of those, but I think it's worth mentioning that long-range precision fires is the priority, the number one priority that enables our ability to shoot. In terms of our ability to move, next-generation combat vehicle and the future vertical lift. In terms of our ability to communicate, the network is the 4th priority. In terms of our ability to protect, it's ballistic missile defense. And last but certainly not least, it's all things that have to do with increasing the lethality of the individual soldier, from the fitness of the soldier to the equipment that they use. And so, in order to set conditions for the Army to achieve unity of effort against these modernization priorities, last winter, as everyone is aware, that the Army announced the stand-up of Futures Command. And at that time, the Army also announced the stand-up of 8 cross-functional teams, 1 cross-functional team for each one of the Army's modernization priorities, and then an additional cross-functional team for assured position navigation and timing in the synthetic training environment. Each of these priorities, and what makes it interesting that Steve and I are here today, but each of these priorities have 2 things in common. One is the need to be defended in cyberspace and the need to be able to operate in cyberspace. And the other is a dependence on the network. So given the current and future reliance on the network, I think that we've got to collectively position ourselves to deliver and aggressively defend to make the Secretary's vision a reality. At the past couple of events, I've spoken about our modernization efforts and the intellectual journey that the Army has been on for about the past 15 months. But as I reflect on my time as a six, having reached, as I said, my one-year anniversary yesterday, from the unprecedented collaboration that occurs on a daily basis, and you can name your organization on the Army staff, from our program executive officers to out in the commands like Army Cyber, to the cross-functional team led by Major General Pete Gallagher, to John Morrison and his team down at the Cyber Center of Excellence, to what was formerly Jim Mingus out at the Mission Command Center of Excellence. I can tell you that fundamentally, as I look back on the last year, your Army is institutionally in a different place than it was just 1 year ago. And so as I conceptualize where we've been with network modernization, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation about the conclusions that we reached over the last 15 months. I believe we spent the first 6 months on this intellectual journey set forth by the Chief of Staff of the Army last March, having a conversation and making the case for why. Why is it the Army is looking to change? This discussion of those first 6 months, because I believe it was kind of a shock to the system. When the Army came forward and said that there were some programs that they wanted to halt, and there were some things that it fundamentally wanted to do differently. But this discussion in this first 6 months about the why of network modernization led to significant interest from both industry and from across the federal government, to include a testimony that many of you had the opportunity to witness on the 27th of September. And yes, I do remember the date well and the time. Last year, when I had the opportunity to be the primary witness before Congress. But based on the feedback we received, the next 5 to 6 months were spent collaborating on probably one of the most important discussions that we had, and that was collaborating with you on the art of the possible, all right, on what was in the art of the possible. And so what can you expect from your Army after the last year to 15 months of network modernization efforts? I think probably the most important thing that you can expect from your Army is a clear-eyed and sober dialogue with you and collaboration with you on the how. So essentially what we've done for the last 12 to 15 months is we've transitioned from a discussion of the why to a dialogue on the what, to now an effort to continue to collaborate with you on the how. And so in terms of how do we intend to shape the force, aligning the force to capitalize on the technological advancements while educating, developing, and as Steve said, retaining the best and brightest talent? How do we intend to build on what we've learned over the last 15 months of intense deep dives on the network from the tactical level all the way to the enterprise, to build on what we've learned to provide simple and intuitive network that is available, reliable, resilient, and operates as a weapon system? How do we intend to get after institutional reform, the institutional reform that's going to be required? Adapting policies and some of the things that I consider to be prohibitive policies in some way, form, or fashion, like the risk management framework, adapting those policies to the warfighter's current needs instead of forcing the warfighter to adapt to legacy prohibitive policy. And last but not least, how do we intend to drive institutional change to promote sustained modernization that will enable the Army to adapt in response to the ever-changing environment? So in its current state, I will tell you that we are in the midst of what I consider to be the largest modernization of our networks in the last 35 years. And I know that that's a bold statement, given the fact that we are still today the best equipped and most lethal force on the earth in terms of our militaries. But to add some perspective, if you think back over the last 35 years, the last time the Army took on a task of this magnitude, we were just beginning to realize, to really internalize the power of the internet. Software-defined capabilities, which are everywhere today, had not been proliferated throughout the battlefield. And in the context of Steve Fogarty's monumental task in cyberspace, we were really just beginning to understand the capability intent of peer adversaries and how they could dominate and how they would impact our networks. So after a year of assessment, which included what I consider to be unprecedented collaboration that I've mentioned, both internally and external to the Army, we've accomplished much. And so in terms of the things that we've accomplished over the last 12 to 15 months, some of those things included the submission of a written strategy for our network from the Secretary of the Army. And I'm not sure, ma'am, the last time we actually did something like this, but an actual written strategy from the Secretary in consultation with the Chief of Staff of the Army to Congress and the publication of an actual implementation plan over the last 90 days. So in terms of, so we have a long ways to go in terms of achieving the vision of a modernized network. But when I look back on the last 12 to 15 months, I say that we've accomplished many great things. And so as we look forward to the future in optimizing the network to account for the requirements in the mission command and tactical network space, I think that there are a couple of enterprise initiatives in what I consider to be the triad of opportunity. In terms of enterprise capabilities that I would highly encourage you to pay close attention to. I think that triad contains three things. One is cloud computing. The other is AI, machine learning. And the third thing has to do with identity credential access management. So why so much emphasis and focus on these data-driven technologies when we've got so much to do in what we consider to be the warfighting mission area? I remember sitting in the CIOG-6 as a colonel, and I was listening to, at that time, the deputy CIO, a gentleman by the name of Mike Krieger. This is in about 2010. And he made a statement then that I thought I would never find myself repeating when he said, "It's all about the data." All right, it's all about the data. And so, given the fact that over 90% of the data that exists in the world today has been generated in the last 24 months, in the last 2 years, take a step back and think about that. All right, over 90% of the data that exists in the world today has been generated in the last 2 years. So when you consider the institutional need to access our data from anywhere, anytime, the mandate to protect our data regardless of the hosting environment, the desire and the market segment that has emerged based on you driving it, that makes it easier to analyze our data, you rapidly come to the conclusion that any attempt to modernize this thing called the network must consider these factors, and that key factor being the data. So when thinking about the potential of artificial intelligence, you need only to pay attention to our peer competitors who made such statements in the last 6 months, some in the last 90 days. Statements like, whoever reaches a breakthrough in AI will come to dominate the world, and others who have set goals of becoming the global AI innovation center by 2030. Each of the stated modernization priorities of the Army would be positively impacted and enhanced by the development and integration of advanced AI tools So I can assure you, this capability has the attention of the senior leadership of the Army. So that said, I consider the enterprise cloud, joint AI center, and ICAM efforts of our DoD CIO, Mr. Dana Deasy, to be absolutely critical and much needed in the force. So if you believe, as Steve mentioned and alluded to, that U.S. supremacy is increasingly contested in the land, in the air, in the sea, in space, and in cyberspace, if you believe the trend that 90% of the data that exists in the world today was generated in the last 2 months, 2 years, if you believe that that trend will continue, if you believe that the over $200 billion that's currently been invested in cloud computing is scheduled to double to almost $500 billion just in the next 24 months, and last but certainly not least, if you believe that AI and machine learning have the potential to change the future character of warfare, then it's a safe bet that after 16 years in a static environment, in a static, uncontested environment, given the evolving, increasing dangerous nature of the threat and the exponential increases in global investments in information technology, it's clear that in terms of modernizing our networks and the need to modernize our networks, the time for redirect is now. And so, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, we've talked about a lot today. We've talked a lot about technology today. But the one thing that I'm constantly reminding people of is we're still in the people business as United States Army. And so Steve talked about talent. General Ham, in his opening remarks, mentioned talent. I truly believe, especially after my visit to Carnegie Mellon about 2 weeks ago, that today the United States Army is in a race for talent. And it is our expectation that in collaboration with you, that our intent is to win that race for talent. There is no way, when you think about the challenges, whether it's machine learning and AI or the efforts that we have ongoing with cloud or the identity and access management initiatives, one of the big conclusions that we reached over the last 12 months is we don't have the institutional talent required to not only thrive, but to win in the environment that I laid out earlier in terms of our networks. And so we're going to be looking to you to integrate your forces and to integrate a lot of your investments. As Steve said, there is going to be some things that we're going to grow internally, but there are going to be some other capabilities that we are going to look to you to provide. And so if there was one more point to make, it's to remind everyone that although we are in the technology business, we're also in the people business. So as we look forward to 2028, another significant task I have in my rucksack is to look at the 13,600 information technology professionals that we have on the rosters today and ask the hard questions about first acknowledging that we don't have the skill sets that we need, and then thinking through how do we pivot to ensure that we've got the skills that we need in 2028. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this transition from why to what to how is as you deal with the Army and as you have conversations with Pete Gallagher is fundamentally important to achieving the vision of 2028 as set forth by the leadership of our Army. And so, General Ham, again, I thank you very much, and I thank you all very much for what you do for us every day. There is absolutely nothing, as I said before, that your United States Army can do without its indispensable industry partners. So thank you very much, Army Strong, and I stand by to answer your questions. All right, not going to answer that one. Yeah, so the question is, and I actually will answer that one. Do we need to start thinking of the network as a weapon and as an offensive weapon? offensive cyber and electromagnetic attack. I think that that's not we need to start. I think that that's been in play for some time. One of the questions becomes, how do we optimize the network to ensure that it can be adequately used as a weapon system? I think when you look at some of the electronic warfare capability that John Morrison and Steve Fogarty are teaming on to roll out, there's no doubt that that's already in place. Where is the Army in creating and building an all-Army cognitive computing enterprise, i.e. artificial intelligence? I think what's been instructional over the last, I'd say 90 days since Mr. DC came on board, and since we started to get our minds around this idea of a joint AI center, has been taking a step back and coming to the conclusion that whether it's AI and the cognitive tools that will be needed for that task or cloud, so we have pockets of excellence that are ongoing right now, but we've got to learn as an institution how to do this if we want to gain and maintain momentum in the area of AI. And so where the Army's in the process of organizing. The one thing that I want you to walk away with is we are 100% behind the stand-up, the Joint AI Center, and we are absolutely 100% behind Mr. DC's efforts to create this environment where we actually learn as an institution, not as an individual service, not one-off efforts, but where we learn as an institution how to actually be more effective and deliver an overarching enterprise cloud strategy.
Thanks, Joe.
All right.